Hey everyone, this week you're going to be asked to use a while loop, a do while loop, switch statement, as well as an if-else statement. So I thought I'd better give you an example of what all of those are. And this is something I wish the class did a lot more of, is just let you play with different things. And that's what I'm going to do. This isn't part of my main project or anything. This is just a play class that I'm just going to use for an example. So you can see I have a main method that's going to execute, and then a bunch of methods that I'm going to be calling that are going to do different things. So first I'll explain my while example. So the while example is going to iterate, or is going to use a while loop to iterate from 0 to 10, and it's just going to output the count and then increment the count by 1, and then after it's finished it'll give me the final count. So let's see and make sure that works the way I think it should. And it thinks examples.java is my main method, so hold on, let me fix that. Okay, so now my main class is the control flow class instead of examples.java. So when I run this, you can see our while loop will execute. It starts at 0 because I initialized count to be 0. So the first iteration, count will be 0, and then it'll increment count to 1, and so on and so forth until count is equal to 10. Right, so it'll print out count as 9, it'll increment it to 10. As soon as count is 10, this condition is no longer true, we bounce out. It'll say we finish counting and the final count will be 10. So you can see that's exactly what we see here. It goes from 9, it increments it to 10, this condition becomes false, we bounce out, print finish counting, and show the final count as 10. Now how does that differ from a do while? Well, let's see. You can see in the do while I do the exact same thing. I start the count at 0, and then I increment, or print out the count variable and increment count by 1 each time, as long as count is less than 10. And then when it's finished, it'll bounce out and print finish counting in the final count. So if I run this now, you see I get the exact same thing. And that's to be expected, right? If you look through this and go through it in our minds, you can see the count starts at 0, 0 is less than 10, or sorry, it's going to output 0. It's actually going to increment count before it does the check. So count now is 1, 1 is less than 10, so on and so forth. When we get to 9, it'll print 9, increment count to become 10, and then this evaluates false. I bounce out and finish printing, and count is still 10. The difference is when the condition is false to begin with. So if, let's say, count is 10 to begin with in each of these cases, I expect in my while example that this won't ever execute because count is 10, this is false, it's just going to bounce out here. So let's double check that. And we can see our count never executed. But in the do while example, I count once, and that's because of the nature of a do while. This will always execute once because it doesn't check the condition until after the code has been run. So in the while, it checks the condition first, executes, checks it again, executes, checks it again, executes. The do while, execute code first, check. If it's true, execute code again, check. So you can see this will always execute at least once. It's not very common in practice to see do whiles anymore, but there is a time and a case for them. So it's good to know at least about them in case you ever have to use them. So now let's look at the difference between a switch and an if-else. So let me just do a couple switch examples first, and I'll explain the switch. So a switch statement, I kind of explained in my last video last week for the view. It takes this parameter, and that's the thing that it's going to check the condition of. So I'm going to switch on this toggle variable. You can see the toggle is a variable that's passed in as a parameter to the method, and so I'm going to pass it in up here. So based on the value of toggle, it's going to check, okay, if toggle is the value 1, I'm going to execute this and then break out of the switch statement. And I'll show you what happens if we don't have that break there. If toggle is 2, I'm going to execute this line. If toggle is anything else, I'm going to execute this default line. So you can see I'll do 1, 2, and then 5. And I should execute 1, then 2, then default. And so let's run. And you can see I executed 1, then 2, then default. If I don't have a break in my case statement, then what's going to happen is in any case that's 1, it will execute this, and it'll just continue and execute this as well. And so you can see that it should execute and say option 1, selection 2, then default, because it'll execute 1. Since there's no break, it'll just move on to 2, and then my second call is going to execute 2, and my last call is going to execute the default. So let's make sure that happens, and yep, I have 2 selection 2s that have executed. So case statements are really useful. They're very readable compared to if-else's, but they have their downsides. For example, you can't switch on strings. Actually, that might have been changed in Java 8, but you can't switch on a lot of different objects. Whereas you can do an if-else statement using any types of objects. So let's look at this if-else example. I'll just swap this out with the if-else example really quickly, and it's going to do the exact same thing as a switch statement. A switch statement is kind of just a less verbose way of doing an if-else. So if toggle is going to be 1, then I'm going to output option 1. Otherwise, if toggle is 2, I'm going to output selection 2. Otherwise, in every other case, this is just like default. In every other case, I'm just going to output this line. So if I execute this, you can see I get the exact same thing as the switch case statement. And that's about it for if-else's. Again, standard way to write these is close your if bracket on one line, start writing the else if with the condition, and then open the new bracket, and then your very last one isn't going to have an if because this is kind of your catch-all, right? If none of these end up being true, it'll jump into this very last else, and this will always execute if nothing else is true. So if you have any questions about this, post to the developer forum. I hope this gave you a really quick overview of what whiles and do whiles do, and I'll post this code, this entire file, to the developer forum if I can, so that you can look at it, download it, and play around with it as well if you want. So if there are any other questions at all about this or anything else, developer forum is going to be the place to ask it. If you need anything else from me, just shoot me an email, and hopefully I'll have another good week this week.